Sharon, thank you so much for sharing that wonderful message with us. I thought we would start with that beautiful quote from Peter that you talked about. Why is it so difficult for us to model gentleness and reverence in this day and age? It's such a challenge.
It is such a challenge. I think our whole world, but even our nation and our communities seem to have gotten to a point where we function on extremes. It's also this or that, black or white, and somehow we can't find the nuances, and that seems to be our challenge.
And people ask, how can we really talk about religious diversity these days when so many people are insisting on exclusivity. I mean, there are Muslims who insist on a Muslim state, Jews who insist on a Jewish state, Christians who want a Christian America.
That's right.
How do we reconcile that?
Well, I think that's why that quote is so important to me, because it really it encourages each one of us to start where we live, to start with the truth that we have in our own heart, to speak what we know, and not to have to force it on anyone else, but to give a witness, to share something that's important to us as we would share anything important to us.
I love what you said in your message, Sharon. How can we all get along? Can we all get along? Which was a wonderful part of the legacy, the living legacy of the historic Parliament of the World's Religions held in Chicago in 1993. What are you finding in your work as a national religious leader, head of the Disciples of Christ, around that ecumenical and interfaith table?
Well, we are all struggling with the same issues. We're all breathing the same cultural air, and so it means that we are, I think, on this common search. I find that we are moving into a new time, and I think we're all looking to new generations who are coming along to help us show the way. I know my own adult children, young adult children, seem to have a spirit of openness and interest and inclusiveness that I think gives me hope for the future.
I'm starting to feel that as well, and I wonder, in my reading about fundamentalism, extreme fundamentalism, what seems to drive that school of thought is this fear, and we really have to look that in the eye and talk about that around the table, don't we?
Yes, and I hope that two things are going to happen just naturally to overcome that fear. One thing is that the very shrinking of the world that I talked about really is going to help us to know each other better. And I think when you know someone, then you begin to understand their very humanness and see the light of God in each one of them. And I think as we get to know each other better, then we will we'll find some answers to this.
And Daniel, your point is good about fundamentalism, because there's fundamentalism, internecine warfare, if you will, among religionists of all faiths.
Absolutely.
And between people of the same faith these days.
Yeah, see, I think fundamentalism of all stripes really has to do with trying to hold on to a past that is behind us. And I think that if we can look at the future that God is trying to bring in among us and be focused more on that future, we're going to let go of the past and we're going to discover
our
each
children
other.
are our future. Tell us how your children, Bethany and Christopher, are embracing that sense of inclusivity. I love that.
Well, our daughter has just entered divinity school, University of Chicago Divinity School, and she has done a lot of travel and is very interested in how, in working to combine public policy and religion in a way that opens up new options for people all across our own country. Our son, Chris, is a political science major at McAllister College in Minnesota, and he too seems to be wanting to find a way that our public lives can mingle with our deepest spiritual longing in a way that gives opportunity and room for everyone to blossom.
Don't leave out your husband.
That's right.
Professor of New Testament.
Professor of Hebrew Scriptures, actually, at Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa. And our kids come by their interest in the spiritual and the political naturally by having him as their dad.
Well, I was going to add, it sounds like it speaks to Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat. He addresses many different issues, some business issues, but this seems totally relevant in what we're talking about in terms of religious faiths and sharing the diversity of our faiths with each other.
I think so. I think the first piece of the show today talked about the God coming into our lives and kind of bubbling up in our lives. And I think that if the extent to which each faith finds that reality, that begins to find a common ground out there where we can discover each other, learn from each other, share what we have to offer, and I think our common humanity comes forth in a way that I'm sure pleases God.
Absolutely.
Discovering, learning, and sharing around that interfaith table. Sharon, what would be your language of faith from your own personal pilgrimage around that interfaith table about your story, your faith tradition?
I would say that in our faith tradition, one of the things that is so important is that each one of us is created in the image of God. Each and every person is created in the image of God, and that we are called through the scriptures prior to Jesus and then in a particular way in Jesus to look upon each human being and see in the face of each human being the face of God, the face of Christ, and then to try to treat that person as we would treat the Christ.
I'm wondering, how do we create more curiosity about other faith traditions, denominations, and so forth? It seems like we're brought up in our faith tradition, or we come to it, and then we lose interest in the way other people practice their faith. And there's profiles that we do on the show, but you can speak to that as well, obviously.
Well, I think it's partly how we raise our kids. I was just talking before the show with a woman who was telling me that at her church, when their kids were confirmed, they decided they needed to have a way of continuing their faith journey. And she's dreaming about taking the kids to go to worship at a synagogue, to go to worship at a mosque, to find ways of helping them to experience different faith traditions so that they can really get to know their own better.
And to be able to say, isn't it interesting how you see God? You know, so many paths to the same God.
Yes. Well, the Bible tells us that God has never left God's self without a witness in any time or any place. And I think that as we learn to get to know other faith communities, we find that again and again.
Now, when you were a little girl growing up in Indianapolis, did you ever realize or dream of becoming a pastor in your denomination and leader of it nationally?
No. I told my parents, I will never marry a minister. And I never thought that I had to try to inoculate myself against being a minister. But no, I never thought that that would happen.
But you grew up in the church.
I grew up in the church, kind of family where every so often we could maybe get out of a day of school just with a kind of little but if we wanted to get out of going to church, boy, we had to have it on the thermometer, a real for real temperature. We were a church-going family.
So,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
It sounds like you feel a real sense of hope, that the dialogue is changing, that there's a movement towards more diversity in what you're seeing.
I have to have hope. Sometimes the evidence does not suggest that we should. I mean, we have to admit that. But yet, God is faithful, and so we have hope. And as I get to know other people who have that same hope, then I think we go with that strength and with those people, and we do the best we can to build the kind of world and kind of community that we think that God intended.
Absolutely.
And you know, one of the detriments to hope is fear. That presumption, immature presumption, I guess, self-willed, that leads to despair. And I guess, how do you talk to young people these days in the church about that? We've got 30 seconds.
I just heard, I think I do say we have to focus on God. And it seems almost too pat, but that is the truth. If we focus on what God's will is and have a sense of each new day dawning, the sense of resurrection, that if you fall down, you get back up again, I think that's where our hope comes.
Thank you so much for
Thank you,
that
Sharon.
message on being loyal to the resurrected Christ.